Who do you think you are? That's what they sneered at her. The mother in the linen blouse, standing quietly at the gates of an elite academy. They didn't know her name. They didn't know who her husband was. And they definitely didn't know that within hours, a helicopter would land on the football field. And everything they thought they knew about power, worth, and dignity would come crashing down. This is the story of Nora Bennett, her son Miles, and how a mother's refusal to bow to cruelty sparked a global movement in education, justice, and grace. You're not ready for how this ends. Now, before we dive deeper, please subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Thank you so much, and now let's get back to the story. Excuse me, are you lost, ma'am? This school isn't open to the public. The words were delivered with a sharp edge, loud enough for others to hear, soft enough to pass as polite. Nora Bennett paused mid-step at the front gate of Sierra Ridge Academy. Her fingers tightened on the worn leather strap of her canvas tote, but her face remained composed, calm, unapologetic. She turned toward the woman who'd spoken, Camilla Grayson, perfectly lacquered in red lipstick, her platinum blonde bob glinting under the soft Northern California sun. Her pearl necklace rested just above the collar of a tailored white Chanel blouse, and her manicured fingers clutched a Louis Vuitton agenda as if it were armor. "I'm not lost," Nora said evenly. "I'm here for my son." There was a flicker of surprise in Camilla's eyes, quickly replaced by something colder, disbelief. Her gaze slid down Nora's outfit, a simple cream blouse, sleeves rolled neatly paired with straight-legged linen pants and scuffed flats. No jewelry. No designer logos, no personal assistant trailing behind her. "Oh," Camilla said, the word drawn out like a sneer wrapped in sugar. "Of course. You're Miles's mother, aren't you?" Behind her, two other mothers exchanged glances and suppressed smirks. One of them whispered behind her hand, "I thought she was the gardener." Nora heard it. She always did, but she didn't blink. She merely offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes and continued walking with quiet grace toward the school entrance. At Sierra Ridge, appearances were currency. Status wasn't something you earned. It was inherited, displayed, flaunted. The campus itself seemed to enforce the rules. Nestled among the emerald vineyards of Sonoma, the school's ivy-covered stone buildings and glass atriums projected privilege like a frequency only the elite could hear. The parent lot was a traffic jam of Teslas, Bentleys, and matte black Range Rovers. Even the students, dressed in their perfectly pressed uniforms and clutching iPads, moved like they knew the world already belonged to them. Nora's son, Miles, did not belong. Not here. Not in their eyes. He didn't wear the branded loafers or talk about Aspen ski trips. He didn't have a last name that echoed through boardrooms or appeared on hospital wings. What he had was curiosity, quiet courage, and a love for stars that filled his sketchbook more than any grade ever could. As Nora stepped into the courtyard, she spotted him sitting alone on a bench, a turkey sandwich in his lap and a pair of hand-me-down sneakers swinging just above the stone tiles. His brown curls hung low over his sketchpad, hiding the embarrassment in his eyes. Across the lawn, a pack of boys laughed, slapping each other's backs, one of them holding up a phone and pointing at Miles. Nora's pace slowed, her jaw tightened. She had seen that phone before. The same one that had recorded her son being tripped in the hallway last week. The same one that had taken a photo of his homemade lunch with the caption, "Charity Case Cuisine," posted to a private Instagram story called Sierra Rejects. She wanted to go to him, kneel beside him, ask what had happened today, because something always did. But she knew her presence would only amplify the shame. So she stood a few yards away and waited, watched. And when his eyes finally lifted and met hers, he tried to smile, and she tried to pretend she didn't see the redness in them. Later, after pickup, Nora walked him home. They lived only a mile away in a modest craftsman house shaded by oaks and redwoods. Their porch had wind chimes and a crooked rocket model Miles had made last summer. There were no gates, no staff, just soil under Nora's nails from her garden and peace in their simplicity. Miles spoke only once on the walk. "They poured juice in my backpack," he said, barely above a whisper. Nora stopped. "Did you tell a teacher?" He nodded. "Miss Adler saw. She just said, 'Accidents happen.'" Nora inhaled slowly, controlling the storm rising in her chest. She smoothed the back of his head and resumed walking. Inside their small kitchen, as she made dinner and Miles scribbled constellations on loose paper, Nora's mind raced, not with rage, but calculation. The Graysons, the Tates, the Langs. They were running that school like a gated country club disguised as an academic institution. And Daniel, her husband, had wanted to keep their donation anonymous to observe the culture. Well, now they'd observed it. The culture was rotten. That night, Nora received an email from another parent, a sympathetic one. Attached was a screenshot, Camilla Grayson's post in the Sierra Ridge Moms Facebook group. "I'm not sure why we're opening doors to people who clearly don't share our values. Sierra Ridge should be a standard, not a charity." The comments were worse. Nora's throat tightened, but she didn't cry. She closed her laptop, walked into Miles's room, and watched him sleep beneath glow-in-the-dark stars. "They don't get to define you," she whispered to the dark. "Not now, not ever." The next morning, Nora took her time getting ready. Her linen shirt, freshly ironed, the same canvas tote. But something in her posture had shifted, shoulders straighter, gaze more focused. She walked Miles to school, kissed his forehead, and then marched to the principal's office. Dr. Susan Adler smiled when Nora entered. It was the kind of smile a woman wore when she thought she was in control. "Mrs. Bennett," she said warmly, "what brings you by?" "I'd like to see the cafeteria footage from yesterday," Nora replied, her voice clear and unflinching. Dr. Adler's smile twitched. "Oh well, there's really no need. Children exaggerate, you know how it is. And I've spoken with the boys' parents. They're deeply sorry for the misunderstanding." Nora's expression didn't move. "It wasn't a misunderstanding, and I'm not asking for an apology. I'm asking for the footage." Before Dr. Adler could answer, the door burst open. Camilla Grayson stepped inside, flanked by two other mothers like she was entering a courtroom. "Are you actually demanding things now?" she barked. "This school has standards, Mrs. Bennett, and if you can't afford to raise your child to fit them." Nora stood slowly, and for a second, just a second, Camilla faltered. Nora's voice was soft, but there was steel in every word. "Your children humiliate mine, your friends record it, your teachers ignore it, and now you want to tell me I'm the problem?" She looked at Dr. Adler. "If Sierra Ridge won't protect my son, then I will." Camilla smirked, folding her arms. "Protect him? With what? That tote bag?" Nora didn't flinch. She turned toward the window, sunlight catching her face, and said quietly, "I'd recommend clearing the football field around 3:15 today." Camilla blinked. "What are you talking about?" But Nora was already walking toward the door, her flats soundless on the hardwood. Outside, the wind picked up. Somewhere in the distance, birds scattered into the blue, and high above the hills, far from view, a helicopter began its slow, deliberate descent. The first to notice the sound was a student, one of the younger ones, his hand still sticky from lunch, his head tilted skyward. "Is that a helicopter?" The question spread like wildfire. By the time the low hum became a roar, the teachers had paused mid-lesson, stepping toward their classroom windows. Students pressed their faces to the glass, eyes wide. On the football field, practice drills came to a halt as coaches shielded their eyes and stared up at the sky. Then the helicopter appeared, sleek, black, and gleaming like obsidian. The Bennett Horizons Foundation logo was emblazoned in silver along its side. The blades sliced the air with rhythmic authority, sending shockwaves of dust and disbelief rippling across Sierra Ridge Academy. Parents spilled out of the alumni lounge, their lattes forgotten, their voices hushed in confusion. Camilla Grayson, standing on the east terrace, clutched her phone tighter, her fingers trembling. "That's not possible," she whispered. Principal Adler stood on the lawn, her mouth slightly open. She knew that name. Everyone in California's philanthropic and tech circles did. The Bennett Horizons Foundation was not just a donor, it was the single largest financial lifeline Sierra Ridge had relied on for over 5 years. And the man stepping out of that helicopter? He wasn't just wealthy. He was a storm in human form. Daniel Bennett descended the steps with slow precision. Tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a crisp gray shirt rolled at the sleeves and dark slacks, he moved with a quiet intensity. His salt and pepper hair caught the sunlight, his jaw set like a soldier walking into battle. At his side walked a young woman in a navy blazer, holding a black folder marked "Urgent." Daniel didn't glance at the gawking crowd, didn't smile, didn't wave. His eyes were locked on one place only, the oak tree near the library where his wife Nora knelt beside their son, wiping crumbs from his lap and tucking the edge of a star chart into his backpack. He reached them in seconds, but his steps felt eternal. Miles looked up first. "Dad?" Daniel smiled, a real one this time. He knelt, brushing a lock of hair from his son's forehead. "You all right, champ?" he asked softly. Miles nodded, but his small voice betrayed him. "I think so." Daniel looked at Nora. She nodded, calm as ever, but her hand resting on her son's shoulder tightened just slightly. A silent conversation passed between them. Then Daniel stood and turned to face the sea of stunned faces. Teachers, donors, the board president, parents with trembling phones raised halfway, unsure whether to record or bow their heads. Dr. Adler took a hesitant step forward. "Mr. Bennett, I wasn't aware you were visiting today." "I wasn't," Daniel said, his voice steady, low and razor-sharp, "until I received a video." The crowd murmured. A few phones buzzed in pockets. Camilla Grayson took a step back, her heels slipping slightly on the turf. Daniel's voice rose, not loud but enough to silence everything. "I watched my son get bullied. Not once, not twice, but for weeks. I saw adults laugh, I saw teachers turn away, and I saw a principal protect donors before children." He turned to the boys who had dumped food on Miles just days before. Brody Grayson stood frozen, his usual smirk evaporated. His friends looked everywhere but at Daniel. "You taught your children to measure worth by watches and shoes. You showed them that kindness was weakness, that silence buys safety, and they believed you." Daniel's gaze moved to the teachers. "You had chances to intervene. You didn't." And then finally his eyes found Camilla. "You told my wife, my son's mother, that she didn't belong here, that he didn't belong here." Camilla opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her face paled as Daniel turned to the assistant and took the black folder. But before he spoke again, Nora stepped forward. For the first time, the quiet woman with the linen shirt and frayed tote bag addressed the crowd. "My name is Nora Bennett," she began, her voice unwavering, "and I am the co-founder of the New Dawn Initiative. Over the past 6 years, we have donated more than $21 million to Sierra Ridge Academy." Gasps, literal gasps broke out. Dr. Adler's clipboard slipped from her fingers. One father dropped his phone. Another mother blinked rapidly, her mouth open like she was trying to swallow the words. Nora continued. "We chose to remain anonymous because we wanted to observe, not influence. We wanted to see what this school could become when no one was looking for a camera or a check." She paused, then held up the folder. "But what we saw was not excellence. It was arrogance. You mocked our son for wearing khakis. You mocked his lunch. You mocked me for not flaunting wealth. And when I asked for a simple truth, you tried to humiliate me." Camilla shook her head in disbelief. This is a stunt. You can't be serious." Nora looked at her, that same serene expression in place. "We're pulling all funding," she said simply. "Every dollar, every grant, every scholarship, effective immediately." The field went still. The blades of the helicopter behind them spun softly, the only sound in the world. Daniel nodded. "And we are withdrawing our son from Sierra Ridge. He deserves better than this." The fallout began instantly. Whispers exploded like sparks in dry grass. Phones flew up. Some recorded, others were frantically typing messages. The words were already leaking into the wind. Bennett's pull funding. Daniel Bennett's son bullied. New Dawn gone. Dr. Adler took a shaky breath. "Wait, please. This can be addressed quietly. We can hold a board meeting." "No," Daniel said. "You already held your meeting when you let my son walk out of here covered in food while you smiled for donors." Nora stepped closer to her husband. Her tote now rested quietly on the grass. Her hand found Daniel's, and their fingers laced together. "We're not trying to destroy Sierra Ridge," she said. "But we won't support a place that teaches cruelty as culture." She looked around, at the stunned crowd of adults who had belittled her, who had whispered behind her back, who had tried to bury her child in shame. "We're building something else. A school where respect is not bought, where no child is measured by their lunchbox, where empathy is strength." She turned to Miles, who stood a little taller now, eyes wide, his fingers curled around his star chart. "Come on, love," she said, reaching for his hand. And as they walked away, the blades of the helicopter rising behind them, it wasn't silence that followed, it was something deeper. Reverence, shame, awe. Because that day Sierra Ridge didn't just lose a donor. It lost its illusion of superiority and gained a mirror to the truth it had spent years avoiding. By the time the Bennett's helicopter had vanished over the tree line, Sierra Ridge Academy was no longer a fortress. It was a crumbling palace, its gold-plated gates peeling under the weight of truth, its pristine facade cracking as the rot beneath was exposed for the world to see. It started with a single video. One student, quiet, overlooked just like Miles, had filmed the helicopter landing. But it was what came after that sent shockwaves across every social platform in under an hour. The confrontation, Daniel Bennett's voice, Nora's poised fury, the revelation of their silent $21 million contribution, and their final, devastating exit. The video was posted anonymously with the caption, "Elite School Humiliates Billionaire's Son, Parents Respond." It hit 1 million views in less than 4 hours. By nightfall, the school's name, Sierra Ridge Scandal, was trending across Twitter, TikTok, and Reddit. Local news stations aired the footage, then national anchors picked it up. By morning, it had reached CNN, MSNBC, and international press. Emails flooded into the school's server, some from concerned parents, others from alumni horrified by what they saw. But the ones that rattled the administration most were from investors, donors, sponsors. Every entity whose money once flowed freely into Sierra Ridge's towering endowment now took a step back, stunned by the institution's casual cruelty. Dr. Susan Adler tried to do damage control. She scheduled an emergency board meeting, issued a vague press statement calling the incident unfortunate and promising increased cultural sensitivity training. But the damage was exponential. Because while Dr. Adler was writing statements, a whistleblower was leaking files. It started with a faculty assistant, young, disillusioned, and disgusted by what she had witnessed. She had seen the group chats, the email threads, the private Sierra parents-only message board where faculty were instructed to handle children who didn't fit the mold. She compiled everything, screenshots, forwarded emails, hidden camera footage. She sent it to 3 national journalists and 1 local outlet that had long been suspicious of the school's unchecked elitism. The next morning, the San Francisco Chronicle broke the story. Inside Sierra Ridge, a culture of cruelty masked by prestige. The article included quotes from former staff members, anonymous students, and even a few brave alumni who had faced similar treatment in years past. It named names, included the full flyer that Nora had once received, with Camilla Grayson's signature glaring in bold. Other parents began coming forward with their own stories of exclusion. Families whose children were subtly pushed out after financial aid approval. Teachers who were reprimanded for advocating too loudly for underprivileged students. Students who'd been mocked for everything from their hair to their hobbies, all in a school that advertised character-based education. That evening, a 60-minute segment aired nationwide. The footage was raw. Miles standing alone in the cafeteria, gravy dripping from his sweater. Brody Grayson's smirk as he high-fived his friends, teachers walking past without a glance. And finally, Nora's voice, clear as a bell. "You've just taught my son the most painful lesson of his life. Thank you. But I'll make sure he learns a better one, my way." Across living rooms and offices and smartphones, people didn't just watch. They listened. They remembered their own scars, and they responded. By week's end, the school board suspended Dr. Adler and launched a full internal investigation. Miss Kendall, the teacher who'd ignored Miles's humiliation and participated in mockery via chat, was fired. Her teaching license was flagged for review by the state. Camilla Grayson, now exposed as the face of the exclusionary petition, found herself blacklisted. Her high society events were canceled, her name scrubbed from charity boards. Brody Grayson and 2 other boys involved in the cafeteria incident were suspended indefinitely, pending expulsion hearings. Their parents' influence could not shield them. Donors pulled $35 million in pledges, and 2 tech companies revoked sponsored programs. The real estate empire owned by Victor Crane, another key parent who had laughed during the gala, saw its stock drop by 18% in 2 days. His PR team tried spinning the story, but screenshots from group chats buried his efforts. Preston Tate, one of the gala attendees who had tossed $1 at Miles's star chart, issued a tearful apology through a press release. But no one was buying it, because while Sierra Ridge tried to bandage a hemorrhage, Harper Global, through a simple pinned post from Daniel, posted a single stoic announcement: "We do not support institutions that confuse prestige with purpose. We build futures, not fortresses." Under it, Nora shared her own message: "Miles deserved better, so do thousands of other children." The post hit 20 million views. Comments flooded in from parents, teachers, and even celebrities who had experienced similar class-based discrimination. Meanwhile, the cafeteria video, first shared on TikTok, reached 50 million views in 3 days. One moment, in particular, became a meme. Brody's face, frozen mid-laugh, became the image for elitism, meet consequence. But for all the outrage and public spectacle, Nora wasn't watching the news. She was back in her garden, planting sunflowers with Miles, sipping tea while he arranged his star maps, sketching out ideas in her notebook, not for revenge, but for something better. Because while Sierra Ridge fell apart, something else was quietly beginning to rise. A blueprint, a name, a vision. The Bennett Learning Initiative, a new school, a new way. It would be in nearby Petaluma. It would be open to students from all backgrounds. It would not accept donations with strings attached. And it would never confuse a child's value with their wardrobe. Nora didn't need validation. She didn't want fame. She wanted Miles, and children like him, to grow up without shame for being kind, or curious, or humble. She wanted the world to remember: you don't need diamond watches to be worthy. You don't need monograms to be magnificent. You only need the courage to stand tall when the world tries to shrink you. And that courage? It had landed on a football field, in a cloud of dust and truth. The wind shifted in Northern California. Not just the kind that danced through the vineyards or stirred the golden grass in the hills around Petaluma, but something deeper, something invisible and powerful. A change of heart, a reckoning, a quiet revolution. It began with a groundbreaking. There were no golden shovels, no velvet ropes or choreographed press events. Just Nora Bennett, in her worn linen shirt, standing on a plot of donated land with Miles by her side, holding a folded blueprint, his brown eyes wide with hope. Beside them stood Daniel, sleeves rolled as always, one hand on his son's shoulder and the other on a wooden stake that read simply, "Future Site of Bennett Academy, where every child belongs." In that moment, there were no spotlights, no reporters, just intention. The next day, a modest press release went out to local papers and educational networks. The Bennett Learning Initiative, a nonprofit founded by Nora and Daniel Bennett, will launch its first independent school campus in Petaluma. Designed to offer need-blind admissions, values-based learning, and community-centered innovation, Bennett Academy will open its doors in September. The world, already watching, leaned in. Within a week, 10,000 applications poured in. Some were from Silicon Valley families disillusioned with elitist institutions. Others came from across the country: single parents, foster guardians, tribal educators, and war veterans who saw in Nora's story a mirror of their own struggles. Nora read each one personally. Every letter, every plea. A mother in rural Mississippi wrote, "My daughter loves the stars like Miles does. But her school says she's too slow for science. Please teach her that she's enough." A father from Detroit wrote, "I raised my boy alone. He wears his cousin's shoes to school and got laughed at. I want him somewhere he can just breathe." Bennett Academy wasn't just a school, it was a promise. Construction moved quickly. Daniel spared no expense, but always with Nora's principals leading the way. Solar panels lined the rooftops. Each classroom had natural light and no more than 15 students. There were therapy dogs, open gardens, and standing desks. The cafeteria? Locally sourced meals with a share table that taught kindness over consumption. There was no uniform requirement, no luxury parking tiers for donors, no names on buildings. But what it did have, what made people weep when they visited, was the wall of wishes, a floor-to-ceiling chalkboard in the main lobby where every student wrote one thing they hoped for. Miles's first entry was simple: a telescope for everyone. His classmates followed. "No one sits alone. I want to learn how to fix my mom's car." To be seen. The stories behind those wishes told of kids who had once been invisible, mocked, written off, like he had. And now, for the first time, they were walking into a place built not to impress, but to embrace. The teaching staff came from every background: a former NASA engineer who left the private sector to teach physics, a public school music teacher who'd been laid off during budget cuts, a poet who once worked in juvenile reform, now running workshops on expression and healing. Nora personally interviewed each candidate. "Tell me about a time a child changed you," she would ask, her gaze steady. If they spoke of numbers or prestige, she thanked them kindly and moved on. If they spoke of wonder or heartbreak or resilience, she hired them. Because Bennett Academy wasn't built to churn out resumes, it was built to build character. In one classroom, a child from Oakland sat beside a child from Menlo Park. One wore shoes 2 sizes too big. The other had a tablet worth more than the car Nora drove. And yet, they shared snacks. They studied the stars together. They began to see each other not through status, but through soul. The media couldn't get enough. Time magazine called it the school that shamed the elite and then showed the world a better way. The New York Times ran a Sunday profile titled, "The Mother Who Changed Education with a Tote Bag." Nora laughed when she read that one. She still carried the same bag, canvas faded, straps repaired, a stitched patch on one side where the initials MB were sewn by Miles himself. "I'll retire it when the work is done," she said once. But deep down, she knew this work was forever. Daniel handled the logistics, the strategy, the funding. But Nora was the soul of the school. Her sketchbook filled with plans, mobile tutoring buses for underserved areas, satellite campuses and reservations in inner cities, scholarships for students with incarcerated parents. She wasn't trying to fix the system. She was building a new one. And Miles? He blossomed. No longer was he linen boy or charity case. At Bennett Academy, he was the kid who taught the entire 3rd grade how to map Jupiter's moons using a paper towel tube and a flashlight. He gave a quiet speech at the school's ribbon-cutting ceremony. "My mom said, 'Stars don't care how rich you are. They shine for everyone. So I want to help everyone see them.'" When he finished, his classmates cheered, not because he was the founder's son, but because he was their friend. Even children who once lived in fear of being seen now raised their hands without trembling. They asked questions. They made mistakes. They hugged each other at recess instead of judging each other's lunches. And the greatest miracle? They started bringing their parents along for the journey. Nora hosted community nights once a month. No donors, no speeches, just potlucks, storytelling circles, and group projects like Build a Solar Oven or Design Your Dream School. One evening, a woman approached her, worn denim jacket, tears in her eyes. "I used to clean houses for families like the Graysons," she whispered. "Now my daughter is in your 3rd grade. She used to be so quiet. Now she sings to the stars." Nora hugged her without hesitation. "She was never quiet," she replied. "She just needed someone to listen." And so, as Sierra Ridge's hallowed halls fell silent, its enrollment dropping, its buildings leased out to charter schools, it became a ghost of what it once claimed to be. Meanwhile, the Bennett Academy buzzed with life, laughter in every hallway, chalk on every wall, dreams in every corner. Nora often sat in her office, surrounded by windows and the smell of jasmine from the garden just outside, watching Miles chase fireflies with classmates who would have once crossed the street to avoid him. She never said, "I told you so." She didn't need to, because what she had built was louder than any insult, stronger than any gate, and more lasting than any legacy the elites of Sierra Ridge ever tried to preserve. It was a school, a sanctuary, a seed that had blossomed into a forest of possibilities. And it had all begun with a canvas tote, a turkey sandwich, and a mother who refused to bow. It was quiet on the porch that night. The kind of quiet only found in the hills after sunset, where the sky stretches wide and velvet dark, and the world finally exhales. Nora Bennett sat in her favorite chair, legs tucked beneath her, wrapped in a soft wool blanket Daniel had bought her years ago from a village in the Alps. Her sketchpad rested on her lap, half filled with new ideas. Plans for the Bennett Mobile Lab, a traveling classroom that would bring science to kids in underserved towns. She hadn't finalized the design yet. She was still thinking about what to paint on the side. Maybe a galaxy. Maybe just a simple message. You matter. Inside, the house was warm and humming. Daniel in the kitchen, Miles's low voice floating from his room as he rehearsed a poem for the school's upcoming fall showcase. But after a few moments, the front door creaked open. "Can I stay up a little?" Miles asked, already wrapped in his blanket, cradling his rocket model like it was made of glass. Nora smiled and patted the seat beside her. Always. He climbed up, leaned into her, his head resting against her shoulder. For a while, they just watched the stars. They didn't need to name them tonight. They didn't need to explain the constellations. They just needed to be still. And then Miles spoke, voice small but steady. "Do you think they'll remember?" "Who, honey?" she asked, brushing a curl behind his ear. "The people at Sierra Ridge. The ones who laughed, the ones who hurt us." He paused. "The ones who didn't stop it." Nora took a breath. The air was crisp with the scent of pine and earth. She looked up at the same stars that had once comforted her son on lonely nights. They twinkled now, bold and bright. "I don't know," she said softly. "Some might forget, people like that. Sometimes they pretend things didn't happen so they don't have to feel guilty." Miles nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." "But," she added, turning slightly to face him, "that's not our story, is it?" He looked up at her. "Our story," she continued, "is about what we built after, what we chose to do with the hurt, how we turned it into something that helps other kids." He smiled faintly. "Like Lucy, she says I'm her best friend, and she used to never talk to anyone." "Exactly," Nora said. "Or Xavier, who wants to be an astronaut now because of you." Miles sat up straighter, pride flickering behind his eyes. "He told me he used to think science was just for rich kids." Nora touched his cheek gently. "You showed him it's for anyone who's curious, anyone who wonders, anyone who dreams." They sat in silence again. An owl hooted from a nearby tree. Somewhere in the valley below, a coyote called out, wild and distant. Then Miles asked the question he hadn't dared voice for weeks. "Were you mad at them? The people who said those things about you?" Nora turned her face back to the stars. Her voice was calm. "I was hurt. But no, I wasn't mad. Not really. I was awake. It showed me who I never want to become, and that was enough." He leaned into her again, breathing slower now. "I think I used to want them to be sorry, but now, I don't need that." She smiled, tears in her eyes. "That means you've already won." Above them, Orion shimmered. Cassiopeia leaned against the night like a crown. The same constellations that had once felt distant, now felt like old friends. Miles had learned their names, drawn them on crumpled paper, traced their stories across his bedroom ceiling. And now he was part of their story too. Because somewhere, in a small town miles away, a boy sat on a rusted fire escape watching the same sky, scrolling through a video of a quiet kid with brown eyes who had once been mocked and forgotten. Now that boy saw hope. In a world that had always told him he was too poor, too weird, too invisible, he saw a kid like him rise, and thousands of others were doing the same. Because Bennett Academy wasn't just a school, it was a ripple, a movement, a message, that humility is not weakness, that grace is power, that you do not need to wear a crown to be royalty. Nora closed her sketchpad. "Come on, love," she said gently. "Let's get you to bed." But Miles didn't move. His eyes were still on the stars. "Do you think they know who I am?" he whispered. Nora looked up. "They always did," she said, "even when others didn't." And so she carried him inside, blanket and all, laying him down gently. He was asleep before his head touched the pillow, rocket clutched tight in his arms. Outside, the stars burned on. Bright, endless, unshaken. Just like the boy who once stood in a cafeteria soaked in shame. Just like the mother who refused to be silent. Just like the school they built from ashes and grace. It began with a single file folder slid across a mahogany conference table. Slim, unassuming, but it might as well have been a loaded weapon. Inside it were documents compiled over months, screenshots of private messages, emails between faculty and wealthy parents, security camera footage, and internal memos that showed not just negligence, but institutional complicity. The kind of evidence that didn't just embarrass a school, it destroyed one. Nora sat beside Daniel in the sleek boardroom of Harper Global's legal headquarters. Across from them, 6 attorneys in tailored suits leaned in as Daniel's head of litigation, a former federal prosecutor named Layla Morris, opened the folder and began her presentation. "The pattern is clear," she said, tapping the table for emphasis. What happened to Miles was not an isolated event. This school, Sierra Ridge, operated with a culture of systemic classism and emotional abuse. Students from non-wealthy families were targeted. Staff members were instructed to ignore it, and in some cases they actively participated. Nora remained silent. She had learned early on that silence unnerved people more than shouting ever could. She listened as names were read aloud. Teachers, donors, parents, students, each one a thread in a tangled net of cruelty. And now, Layla continued, we're not just suing for Miles, we're representing 15 other families. Some alumni, some current parents, some who withdrew their children quietly because they couldn't endure another year of humiliation. Nora's hands rested on her lap, folded carefully. Will they be safe? She asked quietly. The other families? We've taken every precaution, Layla assured her. Anonymity where requested, witness protection for vulnerable individuals, and we've partnered with the Center for Educational Ethics to ensure the case sparks legislative scrutiny. Daniel's fingers drummed the table once before he leaned forward. I want this to go beyond one school, he said. I want a precedent. And he got it. When the lawsuit was officially filed, Harper et al. Versus Sierra Ridge Academy, the news broke like a dam. The complaint was nearly 400 pages. It included testimonies from children as young as 7. One former student said he was forced out of a group project after a classmate's father told the teacher he was too low income to contribute meaningfully. Another girl described how her scholarship was revoked after her mother attended a fundraiser in a thrifted dress. The footage included the now infamous cafeteria video of Miles, gravy soaking his sweater, laughter erupting all around him, and paired it with a teacher's written note that read, "He invites it with that sad lunch." The public reaction was swift and nuclear. Cable news anchors stopped in their tracks. Talk shows devoted full episodes to the story. Celebrities tweeted in support of Nora and Miles, some even sharing their own childhood stories of school-based discrimination. But behind the headlines, the real work was unfolding in the courtroom. The school's legal team tried every tactic: denial, deflection, settlement offers, but Nora refused to be bought. They offered her millions, hush money with polished language, contracts laced with non-disclosure clauses, and promises to restructure internal policies. But she didn't want their money. She wanted their truth. She wanted their admission. One day, during a pre-trial hearing, Camilla Grayson entered the courthouse through a back entrance, but the cameras still found her. Her sunglasses couldn't hide the shame etched into her face. Her power, once so absolute at Sierra Ridge, had shrunk to nothing more than a shield of designer clothes and carefully worded PR statements. She never looked at Nora. She didn't need to, because the trial wasn't about reputations anymore. It was about accountability. On the 5th day of proceedings, the court heard from a former teacher named Mrs. Anaya Velasquez, who had quietly left the school 2 years prior. She hadn't spoken to anyone since. Until now. Her voice trembled as she sat before the judge. I taught Miles Bennett in 2nd grade, she said, and I watched how he was treated. I saw the emails that told us to isolate non-contributing families. I didn't speak up, and I still live with that shame. She turned toward Nora and Miles, who sat quietly at the back of the courtroom, not to be dramatic, but simply because that's where they were most comfortable. I'm sorry, she said, her voice breaking. I should have protected your son. Miles nodded slowly. He was only 10, but in that moment he looked older, like someone who'd carried more than most grown men and still stood tall. Another former parent testified via video from Boston. We withdrew our daughter after a teacher told us she was dragging down the class average. She had dyslexia, and the school labeled her a discipline risk. One by one, the stories came out. A chorus of the ignored, the mocked, the pushed aside. And through it all, Nora sat still. No triumph, no celebration, only steady resolve. Until the day the court reached its conclusion. The judge, a stern but fair woman named Justice Elaine Carter, didn't just rule in the plaintiff's favor. She issued a statement that would be quoted across every major paper in America. Sierra Ridge Academy failed not only as an institution of learning, but as a moral community. The plaintiffs have demonstrated not just negligence, but a culture of exclusion so embedded that it treated cruelty as currency. This court awards $5 million in damages to affected families and demands state oversight of all independent schools receiving private endowment funding. Nora blinked slowly. Not at the number, but at the words. Cruelty as currency. That's what she'd felt all along, that the smiles were weapons, that the silence was sharpened, that the polished fundraising galas were cover for something far more hollow. And now, someone else had said it aloud, publicly, irrevocably. The fallout was immediate. Sierra Ridge's endowment was frozen. Dr. Susan Adler resigned within 24 hours. The state of California opened a formal investigation into 19 other private institutions. And the Department of Education announced a federal initiative to investigate financial discrimination in elite K-12 academies. But to Nora, the most important moment came weeks later. She was walking through a community library where Bennett Academy had just donated new science kits when a little girl, freckles, a gap in her smile, and big purple glasses, came running up with a drawing. It was a picture of a woman standing under stars with the words, "Thank you for making a school where no one laughs at my backpack." Nora knelt, tears stinging her eyes. "What's your name?" she asked. "Jada," the girl beamed. "I want to be an inventor. Like you." Nora hugged her gently. "You already are." Because the real victory wasn't in the courtroom or the headlines. It was here, in the quiet change, the next generation. The kids who now believed in themselves because someone had finally cleared the path. The wind didn't just shift in California, it swept across the country. What began as one mother's quiet stand, her canvas tote held against a storm of cruelty, had sparked something that couldn't be contained. Like a single match in a forest of kindling, Nora Bennett's story ignited a national conversation that had long been buried under platinum card privilege and polished brochures. They called it the Miles Effect. It started online, of course. A viral campaign under the hashtag Miles Deserves More, transformed from digital outcry to real-world momentum. Educators posted their own stories of retaliation for helping underprivileged students. Parents shared anonymous testimonies of being shunned at drop-offs for not fitting the mold. Former private school students described the trauma of silence, exclusion, and never seeing themselves in their classrooms. And then came the letters. Thousands of them. From Seattle to Savannah, Minneapolis to Mobile, Nora received handwritten notes in scribbled crayon and elegant cursive alike. Some read, "You stood up when my school wouldn't. Now I know I'm not alone. We started a kindness wall in our cafeteria because of Miles." She read every one. One envelope arrived from a small town in West Virginia. Inside was a photograph of 5 kids, black, white, Latinx, all standing in front of a classroom mural that read, "Every star deserves a sky." Nora placed it gently on the corkboard in her office. That corkboard grew, so did the movement. Within 3 months of the Sierra Ridge ruling, Bennett Academy was approached by over 60 community leaders and educators from across the country. They all asked the same thing: can we build what you built? Nora didn't hesitate. They formed the Bennett Learning Alliance, a national nonprofit that offered resources, curriculum guidance, and seed funding to create local versions of Bennett Academy tailored to each community's needs. There was Maple Hill Learning Center in Chicago's South Side, focused on STEM access for Black girls. Silver Pine School in Arizona, bringing inclusive education to indigenous youth. The Eastgate Collective in New Jersey, housed in a converted warehouse with labs, art studios, and a mindfulness garden. Daniel managed the infrastructure, mobilizing Harper Global's philanthropic arm to fund each school's foundation, while also pulling in partnerships with like-minded organizations. But it was Nora who remained the soul. She traveled city to city, not as a celebrity, but as a listener. At each site, she asked children the same thing. What do you need to feel safe enough to dream? They told her. A quiet room. A teacher who won't call them dumb. A lunchroom where no one takes pictures of their food. A library where the books have characters who look like them. And at every site, they painted stars on the walls. Not because of astronomy, but because of what Miles once said, "Stars don't care how rich you are, they shine for everyone." Nora's vision wasn't about charity, it was about justice. Not giving a chance, but restoring one that should have never been taken. And that message reached Washington. Senator Judith Ramirez, a former public school teacher from Oregon, introduced a bill titled the Educational Equity and Dignity Act, a policy package that would provide federal oversight for private K-12 institutions that received public subsidies or grants. In her speech on the Senate floor, she held up a printed photo of Miles at the cafeteria table. "Never again," she said, her voice shaking. should a child be humiliated for their mother's shoes or the lunch in their bag. Never again should institutions confuse entitlement with excellence. The bill passed committee. But more powerful than legislation was the cultural shift. Elite schools across the country scrambled to update their codes of conduct. Board members resigned, consulting firms were hired, private parent groups dissolved. Some changes were genuine, others cosmetic. But the fear was real, because no one wanted to become the next Sierra Ridge. Meanwhile, Bennett Academy continued to expand, not with marble columns or fountains but with mission. One satellite campus opened in New Orleans, its hallways filled with laughter and jazz. Another opened in Detroit, focused on vocational training and robotics. Each campus bore a plaque near the front door that read, "This school was built from a mother's refusal to be silent." One day, Nora was invited to deliver the keynote at the National Education for All Summit in Atlanta. Thousands of educators, parents, activists, and students filled the hall. She stepped onto the stage in a simple beige blouse, still no jewelry, still carrying the same canvas tote with the patch Miles had sewn. No lights, no hype, just truth. "I didn't set out to build a movement," she began. "I just wanted my son to be safe. I wanted him to believe that the stars he drew weren't silly, that he mattered, that his mother mattered." She paused. "I didn't need the world to love him. I just needed them to leave room for his light." The crowd rose, not in applause, but in unity. She had become what no prep school could manufacture, a symbol, a leader, a North Star. That night, back in her hotel room, she received a message request from someone unexpected, Brody Grayson. She stared at the name for a long moment before opening it. "Mrs. Bennett, I don't expect you to reply. I just needed to say I'm sorry. I was cruel. I thought making fun of your son made me powerful. I know now it made me small. I'm in therapy now, and I volunteer with a tutoring program because I wanted to start making it right. Please tell Miles I remember the chart he drew. It was beautiful. He was always better than us. I see that now." She closed her phone. Tears welled in her eyes, not because she needed validation, but because something she never thought she'd see had bloomed in the ashes. Accountability. And if one boy could unlearn cruelty, then maybe the system could too. The leaves had begun to turn golden in the hills of Petaluma, curling and drifting like time made visible. The school year at Bennett Academy was in full bloom, classrooms bursting with color and curiosity, gardens tended by eager student hands, and a chalk mural near the cafeteria that read in bold letters, "Kindness is the only uniform we wear." And yet, as calm as things appeared, Nora Bennett knew there were still chapters unwritten. Not everyone had disappeared in the wake of the scandal. Some lingered, watching, wondering what it meant to face the weight of the harm they'd once caused. So when the invitation landed in her inbox, she paused. Subject, request for a meeting, Camilla Grayson. Nora read it 3 times. It was short, tightly worded, but not defensive. "Mrs. Bennett, I understand if you decline, but I would like the chance to speak with you in person, not for press, not for show, just for honesty's sake." Daniel saw her hesitate. "You don't have to respond," he said gently, placing a mug of mint tea beside her. "I know," she replied, "but maybe I do." They met at a public park in Palo Alto, a neutral place, quiet, surrounded by sycamore trees that whispered in the wind. Camilla was already seated on the far end of a bench, wearing a conservative gray sweater and black flats instead of her usual couture. Her makeup was minimal, her presence smaller. She looked older, not just in years, but in wear. Nora approached slowly, her steps steady. Camilla stood and opened her mouth, but no words came out. So Nora broke the silence. "Sit," she said, voice calm but unyielding. They sat. "I won't waste your time," Camilla began. "I was cruel. I mocked you. I laughed at your son. I encouraged others to do the same, and I justified it all because I thought you challenged what made Sierra Ridge powerful." Nora said nothing. Camilla took a shaky breath. "But now I know. We weren't powerful. We were scared. Afraid that if we let people like you in, we'd be forced to look at ourselves, and we didn't like what we'd see." Nora let the silence stretch. Finally, she spoke. "What changed?" Camilla blinked fast. "Everything. My daughter stopped speaking to me. My friends vanished. I lost my position on 3 boards. People don't return my calls, but it's not the fall I regret." She turned, and for the first time, Nora saw something real in her face. Not pity, not manipulation. Shame. It's the memory of your son, Camilla whispered, standing there, not crying, just absorbing it all. The way I've tried to forget that look, I can't. It wakes me up at night. Nora looked away, toward a child swinging high into the sky, laughter ringing out over the grass. You came for peace, didn't you? She asked softly. Camilla nodded. But Nora shook her head. Peace isn't something I hand out like tokens. It's something you earn, over time, by how you live, not what you say. Camilla looked down. I understand. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Nora said, There's a free literacy center opening in East Oakland next month. Underfunded, understaffed, I'll send you the address. Camilla looked up, confused. If you want peace, Nora said, start there. Not with me, with them. Camilla's voice broke. Thank you. I'm not doing it for you, Nora replied. I'm doing it for the girls who look like I once did, walking into rooms filled with cold smiles and sharper words. They deserve to see what humility looks like. Camilla nodded. She stood, hesitated, then walked away without looking back. Nora didn't need her to, because that wasn't the only reckoning quietly unfolding. Back at Bennett Academy, in a sunlit classroom adorned with star maps and paper planets, Miles received a letter, not digital, handwritten, from Brody Grayson. He read it twice before bringing it to Nora. Should I answer? He asked. She studied her son, taller now, his voice starting to shift, but still carrying the same quiet fire in his eyes. What do you feel? She asked. Miles looked at the page again. He said he's sorry, and I think he means it, but I don't know if I'm ready. Nora smiled gently. Then you're allowed to wait. I don't want to hate him forever. You won't, she said, because you're already asking the right questions. 2 weeks later, Miles did write back. Brody, thank you for your letter. I don't forget what happened, but I hope you're serious about changing. Not for me, for whoever the next kid is. I used to wish people like you would just disappear. Now I just wish you'd stand up for someone the way you didn't for me. Miles. He never heard back. But that wasn't the point. That same month, Brody was seen volunteering weekly at a youth center in San Francisco. Quietly, no press, no selfies, just showing up, week after week. Some wounds don't close with apologies, but they don't have to bleed forever either. By winter, the ripple of redemption had spread far beyond just the Graysons and Sierra Ridge. A former board member from the school launched a fund to support trauma therapy for kids in elite school environments. Several of the mocking parents from the infamous gala reached out to Bennett Academy asking how they could contribute. Nora told them, start by listening, then stay quiet long enough to learn. And they did. Some fumbled. Some gave up, but some stayed. Humbled. Changed. One day, during a school assembly at Bennett Academy, a second-grade student raised her hand after a guest speaker asked, What do you want to be when you grow up? The girl stood. I want to be someone who makes mean people sorry. There was a pause, then laughter, the good kind. And Miles, sitting nearby, whispered to the teacher, I think she means someone like my mom. Because redemption, when it's real, isn't loud, it's quiet choices. Consistent change, owning what you broke and building what you never thought you could. And sometimes, redemption means admitting the truth. That you were wrong. And someone else was stronger than you ever deserved to meet. It started with a boy in Johannesburg. He stood in front of a chalkboard smeared with equations and starlight, gripping a crumpled piece of paper. A teacher had just finished reading an article aloud, an international piece on the Bennett Learning Alliance. The headline had translated poorly into Afrikaans, but the message was crystal clear. Mother turns shame into schools, the Bennett Revolution spreads. The boy, no older than 10, raised his hand, his voice trembling but proud. I want to be like her, the lady with the tote bag. The class clapped, and the teacher smiled as if something sacred had just unfolded. Because now, they all knew her name. Bennett Academy had become more than a school. It was a blueprint, a living movement, one that crossed oceans, pierced through red tape, and wedged itself into the hardest, most guarded corners of institutional failure. It grew, not with glossy brochures or PR campaigns, but with stories. Stories of kids once labeled difficult, now leading student councils. Stories of refugee children in Paris learning English under murals of galaxies. Stories of girls in Mumbai, once silenced in overcrowded classrooms, now debating philosophy under open skies. Stories of a school in São Paulo that repurposed a defunct soccer stadium into a tech campus, modeled after Bennett Academy's open learning design. Everywhere Nora and Daniel went, people showed up, not to worship, but to learn. In Uganda, an orphanage wrote, "We took your lunchroom policy and added it to our community center. Now kids trade food they don't like with each other instead of going hungry." In rural Montana, a single mother emailed, "Your curriculum gave my son the courage to say he wants to be a writer." Before, he didn't even believe he deserved a desk. And in a former steel town in Pennsylvania, a school counselor held back tears during a video call with Nora. "You didn't just build schools," she said. "You gave us permission to expect more." Daniel, ever the strategist, expanded the foundation's reach across 5 continents. But it was still Nora's heart that shaped its purpose. She implemented Listening Week at every new school, where students designed 1 week of the year based entirely on what they felt their school needed. Some requested a sleep pod room, others a meditation garden. One school in Kentucky asked for Friday Laugh Day, where every class started with a joke told by the quietest kid. And no matter the country, no matter the income bracket, every Bennett-inspired school had the same 2 things. 1, a star wall, where children mapped out their dreams with drawings, not grades. 2, a lunchroom share table, where no one ate alone and leftovers were never wasted. These weren't symbolic, they were sacred, because Miles's story had become universal. The boy once mocked for his sandwich and sweater had grown into a quiet leader, still modest, still wide-eyed about space, but now bolder. When he gave talks, he never mentioned the bullying unless someone asked. He preferred to speak about telescopes, patterns in the stars, and kindness. One day, at a summit in Copenhagen, a journalist asked him, "What do you think your legacy will be?" Miles blinked. "I don't want a legacy," he said. "I just want kids to have a tomorrow that doesn't hurt." The room went silent. He didn't need applause, because somewhere, across the world, a child was hearing that and finally believing it. In the States, Nora received an invitation from the White House. She declined. Not out of pride, but because she was scheduled to visit a small school in rural Alaska that same day. A new Bennett partner site. The school didn't have Wi-Fi, the roof leaked, but the children had already drawn stars on their ceilings. "I'd rather be there," she said simply. And when the press asked why she wouldn't accept the President's Medal of Civic Impact, she responded, "I didn't do this for medals. I did it because my son came home in tears, and no one else seemed to care." But others cared now. The Bennett Learning Alliance had influenced national policy across 12 countries. Over 200 schools had adopted their Dignity First models. And their online teacher training portal hit 1 million downloads in less than 6 months. Nora was invited to be the keynote speaker at UNESCO's Global Forum for Education Equity. She wore her linen shirt, carried the same canvas tote. And before stepping onto that stage in Paris, she sat in a quiet room alone, rereading the original letter that Miles had once written to a boy he never got to forgive. "Not for me, for whoever the next kid is." She folded it, slipped it into her tote, and walked out to a standing ovation before she even said a word. Back home in Petaluma, the original Bennett Academy had grown into a full campus, a library with curved glass walls and constellation floors, a green roof covered in herbs and vegetables tended by second graders, a multi-purpose hall named not after Daniel, but after Nora's grandmother, a civil rights teacher from the Deep South, who once taught literacy in churches lit by oil lamps. One evening, as dusk rolled over the valley, Daniel and Nora stood watching Miles from a distance. He was sitting under the star mural in the courtyard, surrounded by children half his age, telling them a story. The kind of story that didn't need villains or victories, just heart. "Do you think he knows?" Daniel asked softly. "What he started?" Nora smiled. "He doesn't need to know," she replied. "He just needs to keep being who he is." And in that moment, watching her son, the boy they once tried to break, become the beacon others followed, she felt something deeper than vindication. She felt home. Because this legacy wasn't about the school, or the lawsuit, or the viral video. It was about what survived, and what flourished. The lights dimmed in the auditorium, leaving only a soft glow on the stage and the distant outline of a podium. Murmurs settled, phones turned off, breath held. This wasn't just any event. It was the Global Youth Summit for Justice and Education, held in Kyoto, a city where cherry blossoms fall like whispers and history breathes in every alley. The room was filled with world leaders, Nobel laureates, teenage prodigies, poets, rebels, reformers, and survivors. And then, quietly, he stepped onto the stage. Miles Bennett, 17 years old. No flash, no fanfare, just a slim boy with wide brown eyes, a deep navy blazer, and a folded piece of paper in one hand. His hair was a little longer now, brushed back but still untamed, like it had better things to do than obey. His voice, when he finally spoke, didn't need to be loud. It only needed to be honest. "Good evening," he said, and the hall stilled. "My name is Miles, and a few years ago, I ate lunch alone." A soft ripple went through the audience. He looked down briefly at his paper, then folded it and placed it on the podium. "I wrote something prepared," he said with a half smile. "But I think I want to just tell you a story instead." He stepped slightly to the side of the podium, away from the spotlight's center. "I used to think stars were magic, that they only appeared for certain people. The ones who wore the right shoes, spoke the right way, carried the right name. For a long time, I didn't think they shone for me." He paused. "Because one day I sat in a cafeteria covered in mashed potatoes, while people laughed and took videos, and my teacher looked the other way." People in the audience lowered their eyes, some wept openly, some just clenched their fists. "My mother," he continued, "stood in a room full of people who thought they were better than her. Because she wore linen instead of silk, because her tote bag had frayed edges, because she smiled too kindly in a place that valued sharpness." He took a breath, and they thought she would break. But instead, she built. The screens behind him lit up, images from around the world. A girl in Lagos reading under a solar lantern, a boy in New Mexico launching a handmade rocket, a trans student in Brazil presenting a science fair project called Gravity is for Everyone. "I'm not the smartest person in this room," Miles said. "I'm not the bravest. I've been quiet most of my life. But I learned something that day, when my dad landed a helicopter and everyone finally saw who we were." He looked up. "You don't need a helicopter to be powerful. You need clarity. You need the courage to say, 'This is wrong,' even when it's just your voice, against an ocean of silence." He stepped forward, away from even the faint boundary of the stage's shadow. "You see me now in this blazer, giving a speech at a summit. But I'm still that kid who draws constellations, who eats turkey sandwiches, who wants everyone to see the stars." The screens behind him went black. One word appeared: dignity. "I don't need to be famous," he said. "I don't want applause. I want kids to walk into school tomorrow and feel safe enough to raise their hand. I want a girl somewhere in Detroit to say, 'I think I could be a scientist,' and not be laughed at. I want a boy in rural Thailand to believe that his voice matters, even if it shakes." He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. "My mom once told me, 'Stars don't care how rich you are, they shine for everyone.' I think I finally believe her." And with that, he nodded and walked off the stage. There was a moment of absolute silence. And then, the auditorium rose to its feet. Not in a rush, not in a frenzy, but slowly, reverently, as if everyone present recognized they had just witnessed something rare. Not a speech, a passing of light. Nora watched from the very back row. She was still in her linen blouse. The same canvas tote rested beside her chair, patched and old. Her eyes shimmered, not with pride, but with peace. Daniel leaned over, whispering, "He doesn't even know what he just did, does he?" She shook her head with a soft smile. That's why it worked. Later that night, back in their hotel room, Miles sat barefoot on the floor, staring out at the Kyoto skyline. Paper lanterns floated in the distance like airborne memories. Nora sat beside him, cross-legged. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded. "I didn't say what I wrote." "I know, but I said what I needed to. I know that too." He hesitated, then asked, "Do you think they're proud? The kids who didn't get a chance? The ones we couldn't help fast enough?" Nora was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I think they were the first to hear you." Miles looked out at the stars. "Do you think they know who I am now?" Nora leaned her head on his shoulder, just like she used to on those lonely nights back in Petaluma when all he wanted was to disappear. "They always did, baby," she whispered, "even before the rest of the world caught up." And there, under a foreign sky, wrapped in the legacy of pain turned to purpose, mother and son sat in silence, two constellations stitched by love. One born in shame, the other forged in resolve. And together they burned not with vengeance, but with light. To anyone watching this, if you've ever felt like you didn't belong, like your clothes, your voice, your background made you invisible or unworthy, this story is for you. Nora Bennett didn't fight back with fists. She didn't shout. She stood her ground with grace, with truth, and with love for her son. And that was more powerful than any wealth or privilege ever could be. Remember, the world will try to measure you by the wrong things, but your light, your kindness, your resilience, your courage is beyond measurement. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. And in the comments below, tell us, what's one thing they said you'd never be, that you've become anyway? Because like Miles said, stars shine for everyone.